the Most High first, Sonya Hawashai. It's back your brother Oxy18X. Back with your brother KW.
Yes,
We
sir.
just read you the context page, and now we're about to enter chapter 1 of the book called True Myth Black Vikings of the Middle Ages by Nasheed Al Amin. Chapter 1. The Ancient World Reconsidered. When we hear the term Viking, the image that comes into mind most readily is that all tall, blonde, broad-shouldered, bearded white men dressed in animal skins, wearing a rounded helmet with horns protruding from either side of it. Many books written by Western scholars present illustrations of Norsemen thusly attired, and the few Viking films that have been made reinforce this image. Although Vikings rarely, if ever, wore such helmets, oh my,
Amen.
or never actually wore them,
Oh,
numerous books have chronicled
wow.
the exploits of vigorous peoples called Norsemen or Northmen who swooped down from Scandinavia to wreak havoc on civilizations from the British Isles to Spain, Italy, France, and Russia. That these Vikings or Norsemen left an indelible impact on the terrorists and the territories they scourged is undeniable. that they were that they were all members of a white Nordic race, however, is questionable for ample evidence heretofore not unknown, strongly confirms that a substantial number of these people were black or dark skinned. Black skinned will not always denote African. Like I said, brothers. Like I said when I was reading the content. Okay?
Amen.
Not every colored person is from so called Africa. Noah had 3 sons and all of them were black. If that would help you out. The no African. In this work, although most people, especially Caucasians, seem to associate blackness of skin exclusively with Africa. However, there are numerous black skinned Indians from India, Indonesians, Burmese or Burmese, Pacific Islanders, and South Asians, and will be shown several millennia ago the Earth's population was comprised of many more black skinned peoples in these areas. As well as in Asia, Europe, generally white historians and anthropologists have classified the populations of some of the aforementioned areas, including the black skinned so called Aborigines of Australia, Caucasians, by methods only they seem to understand, which has only added to confusion in those of us unacquainted with the intricate methods of categorizations. Even new DNA technology has not clarified the issue. Somehow arriving at the same conclusion that the pre-DNA historians and scientists have asserted for 2 centuries or so in regard to race. The new DNA science has forced Eurocentric scholars and historians to grudgingly admit that the origin of Homo sapiens or modern man was Africa. But a number of them, although this theory is at least 2 centuries old, are still uncomfortable with this notion and continue to seek ways to revise it, rework it, disprove it, to fit the Eurocentric racial models they have so long cherished. So, brothers, the man said that to say in a nice way possible that other races, especially races of more paleness, they think about your black ass and where you're from, man. I reject the classifying of those obviously black, brown, and dark pigmented people as Caucasians or white, as Eurocentric historians and scientists do the Aborigines, Indians, and historic peoples like ancient Ethiopian and Egyptians, and the reader who wishes to understand this humble work needs to understand that an element of white race or people who consider themselves white, different and perhaps superior to the dark races of mankind, introduced the theory of race, nurtured it after the invading territories of the darker races all over the earth, destroying civilizations, countless human beings in the process. They then wrote the books that most of us read, depicting those deeds and assigning this or that people to one race or another. A plague arose and continues to afflict most of the people. Racism is the dominant malady infecting today's world, more than crime, drugs, pollution, weapons of mass distraction, mass destruction. Mm-mm-mm. Poverty, poverty, cancer, and war. Racism, in fact, seem to be at the root of most wars fought over the last 1,000 years or so, perhaps longer. Obviously, at least to this writer, a factor in the First Crusade ten in 1096. Hey, brothers, he didn't. For those of you brothers who may be familiar with a man called Chronicles of Judah 144. He was the first person that I ever heard point out that a lot of the wars in the Middle Ages and right after the Dark Ages were overtly racially based as much as religion and other things. A factor in the First Crusade in 1096 when Christian Europe, with the blessing of Pope Urban II, invaded the Holy Land to wrest Jerusalem, or Yasharallah, what we know today as Jerusalem, from the infidels, dark-skinned Muslims, Turks, and Saracens. European and American historians, of course, cite the other causes for the war Europeans have waged since the decline of Greece and the fall of Rome at the end of the 5th century. But even a cursory look at wars fought by Europeans outside the European continent would show them to have been expansionist and waged when European countries were not fighting each other against dark-skinned people, except perhaps for World War One and the Revolutionary War. Race has been a factor in all of America's wars, beginning with the subjugation and near genocide of Native American peoples in establishing what will become the United States of America. Eurocentric historians and scholars almost never mention racism, that is, a collective white racial hatred toward non-white people. In the assessments of European colonization and warfare, they have excused European trespasses and the destruction of numerous non-Caucasian cultures and peoples as a mere acts of economic necessity for Europeans or strategic utilitarianism or necessary evil, exhibiting not the slightest regard for the lives of the affected populations in the areas overrun. Europe needed trade. Europe needed spices. Europe or a particular European country needed a trade route to the east. Europe needed raw materials. Europe or particular European countries needed slaves. Europe needed oil to maintain its industrial growth. The people who suffered the loss of their lands, way of life, resources, and lives, or particular civilizations are less important than the needs of European nations. Their result, their resultant fate goes unnoted or mentioned in a brief afterthought at the end of a historian's chapter. The most profitable pursuits by Europeans for trade, resources, slaves, and other riches were into areas of the world populated by dark-skinned people: Africa, the Middle East, Southern Asia, South America, the Caribbean, China, the Isles of the Pacific. Yet racism, the dehumanization of dark-skinned people in the minds of Europeans, their bold and often undesired intrusions into areas inhabited by dark-skinned populaces, their use of more modern weaponry to subdue these populaces, the guiltless slaughter of untold numbers of people is never mentioned by historians who write the events of what we ingest in schools, universities, and our private readings, which invariably present a one-sided picture of what a one-sided picture. The European side, we have become used to this presentation of history without realizing that another whole side is missing. Practically unrecorded, unknown, whether we like it or not. The vast majority of inhabitants in Europe, Canada, India, South and Central America, and the Caribbean, Africa, and the United States, whatever our individual race or racial background, are westernized and attuned to Eurocentric thought and values. Most of the dark races of the world have not totally kicked free of the shackles of colonization, slavery, imperialism, fear, and subjugation that they lived under for the last 5 centuries, and the whites of Europe and North America having shaped our modern world and more, having benefited from the injustices their ancestors wrought and continue to affect against the darker races of the world, have not let go of the racial animus that consumed their forefathers, no matter how enlightened, liberal, or tolerant some may feel they are. The scholars who write the histories we read are predominantly white and Eurocentric, and their writings present a Eurocentric view of history, offering very little information on the contributions of black or dark skinned people to civilization. One method employed by Eurocentric historians to erase dark skinned people from history is to declare them white, assert that this or that people were Caucasian, as they have done with the ancient Kemetians, aka ancient Egyptians, the ancient Indians, Ethiopians, Australians, Aborigines, and other races, which be discussed further in this work. It will also become apparent that Western scholars have ignored the presence of black and dark-skinned non-Caucasian people in Europe, so that we think of Europe as always having been a continent inhabited exclusively by white-skinned people. True myth. Black Vikings of the Middle Ages, Chapter 1, page 3. To assert that the Vikings or Norsemen were primarily black skinned must cause the average reader to smile at this writer's naivety, a naivety certainly attributable to the publication of fairly recent books and scholarly articles by African American and other non white scholars who have emerged over these last 3 or 4 decades to challenge the oft repeated assertions of white historians whose numerous works have shaped the consciousness of the people of the world for the last several centuries. Are nurturing by historians and scientists have been masterfully accomplished, and we believe, for an instance, that Asia has always been inhabited by Mongoloid or yellow people. Europe has always been inhabited by Caucasian or white people, and Africa has, for the most part, always been inhabited by Negroid or black people. No damn sense in that. The analysis, the analyst, the analysis. I think you spelled analysis wrong. The analysis contend have never contributed much of anything to civilization. We look at the present distributions of races over the continents they dominate today and assume that these distributions have been consistent, especially the Caucasian presence in Europe. Black scholars and scientists have drilled into us, could not have survived the colder climates of Europe and Northern Asia, while the writers of scientific historical treaties seem to be caught in the trend of moving away from racial considerations in their writing, enlightened by the new science of DNA and what science reveals about racial intermixing. So much damage has been done by centuries old focus on race by Eurocentric scholars that suddenly replacing this focus with a supposed race free veneer would merely increase the damage and confusion wrought by 3 centuries of Eurocentric race based scholarship. Blacks and other dark skinned people who have been written out of history would still not find themselves in it. White or white nations who perpetrated crimes against them could not be singled out again and condemned in absentia for racial crimes against humanity. Eurocentric writers whose racial theories we have inculcated, whose often deliberate fabrications have obscured the blackness of some civilizations would go unexposed and unvilified, an expression that has become popular in the United States over the last 2 or 3 decades. Let's move on. An aphorism implying that the past is done. The present should be concerned with forging a new future. Listen to me here about this if you're listening to this. Your past is just as important as your future. Don't let these people with wicked spirits, people who don't care about the background of anything, deter you from researching and finding out some of these truths for yourselves. But simply to move on and would not rectify the damage that has been done over the past several centuries or reveal the falsehoods and omissions by the majority of Eurocentric scholars. So this work will discuss race in terms we have come to understand, referring to the black, brown, red, yellow, or white races that Eurocentric scholars originated and have drummed into us for 3 centuries that we have become accustomed to and which most of us still abide by only then, after considering what is presented in this work, might we be able to move on. Mm-mm. True myth. Black Vikings of the Middle Ages by Nasheed Al Amin, page 3. History should show that the races of man have been constantly in flux and that over many millennia, various peoples have migrated from one territory to another, vanquishing, settling, and among intermingling with the races they encountered and often spawning new races and acquiring or imposing new languages, customs, and law over the last 2 decades. Although such a theory has existed for 2 centuries, it has been universally acknowledged by most scholars that true man first evolved in Africa, and then migrated over untold millennia to nearly every part of the earth, including northern climes. His movement out of the mother continent was made easier during the last great ice age, warm glacial, the beginning roughly 2.5 million years ago. The place the Pleistocene epoch, and lasting until 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, ocean and sea levels have fell significantly and land bridges were formed connecting the Iberian Peninsula to North Africa and Italy to Sicily and Sicily with North Africa, or close enough to North Africa that the two continents were separated by a narrow channel of water between them. Northern Asia formed a wide land bridge connecting with Alaska. Southern Asia and Indonesia were joined more solid in a more solid landmass, which may have stretched to Australia, as well as many Greek isles were larger, and there was a land bridge connected to Asia Minor, also known as Turkey, the Greater and Lesser Antilles, also known as the Caribbean islands stretching from Cuba to Trinidad. May have been a solid landmass stretching from the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico to northern South America. Japan and the Philippines may have merged with China. Northern Japan may have been joined to the Sakhalin Peninsula and northeastern Russia. The Red Sea and the Persian Gulf may have not existed, joining Africa and southwestern Asia in one solid landmass, with Arabia sandwiched between them. The whole of northern Europe was covered by glacial ice, as was much of northern Asia, and this was the prevailing condition on Earth for more than 2 million years, until the glacial ice finally settled, raising sea levels and producing the present formations of continents and island masses only 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. True Myth: Black Vikings of the Middle Ages by Nasheed Al Amin, page 4. In 1989, a theory was developed by the late Alan C. Wilson of the History of California, Berkeley, strongly suggesting that the first anatomical modern human beings evolved in Africa 1,806,000 to 249,000 years ago. Washington Post, September 27th, 1991, the new evidence of Eve. This was the controversial study which was asserted that all human beings are ancestors of a single African woman.
Oh my
Dr. Wilson,
god.
Dr. Wilson's theory is study which is hardly new. Sorry, that threw me off.
Nah, hey man.
He and his colleague compared a special DNA typed down through the maternal line changes or mutations that DNA undergoes can be counted, and analysis showed that the trunk of the tree was in Africa. A rival theory insists that man did not evolve into Homo sapien in Africa but left Africa as Homo erectus and evolved into true humans simultaneously in different parts of the earth. But whether Homo erectus or Homo sapiens walked out of Africa is not essential at this point. You know who I think they called it, who this Homo erectus person is, who I think they always mention?
Cool, brother.
I think Homo erectus, you know, in Genesis, when all the other creatures of the land was out there and nobody had a soul except Adam?
Yep. Adam
Yeah,
was
that's Homo
supreme.
erectus.
Oh shit.
I think the sapien, which is a man with a brain, we all know who the first man with a brain was, even though he didn't use it.
Hey man. Unfortunate. Unfortunate.
Why is this that for as long as we have studied, we've seen that the master of humanity that flowed out of Africa have been black skinned, and common sense should tell us that the earliest man must have remained for many millennia after he reached various territories in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas before climate or other still to be determined factors caused him to differentiate into other races over time predominated in the region he found himself in. The earliest Homo sapiens, short and pygmy like, are often referred to as negritos.
Wow. Wow.
These first humans spread from Africa, probably East Africa,
Hmm. 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 Hmm.
to nearly all parts of the earth, and we must assume that they resembled in complexion, physiognomy, and the present pygmies of Central Africa, where they really come from.
All right.
They would have emerged during the Paleolithic period or Old Stone Age if man were in existence 249,000 years ago, accepting Dr. Wilson's conclusion. Although, bracket, although some believe that man has existed much longer, close bracket, it must be also considered that the physiognomy of man to be differentiate in muscular musculature, dexterity, limb length and waviness of hair and skin tone, jet black, dark brown, blue black, reddish black, copper colored, reddish brown, and so on. You didn't miss a beat. Brought about by the inexorable forces of African nature, which first thought true men into existence, and not by naturalistic forces outside of the African continent. Although these must be considered, however long these genetic alterations took to produce each physical altered human type, there is evidence of a mongoloid characteristic in one or more present-day southern African tribes, and for each type to migrate out of Africa to some other part of the earth to those humans were essentially black and remained so for many millennia afterward in the areas they eventually settled. We can fathom the extent of black-skinned humanity, the earth, in the statements of historians and scholars who have long written this reality, although their works and comments are largely overlooked in today in Why We Behave Like Human Beings. George A. Dorsey states, "Open your atlas to a map of the world. Look at the Indian Ocean on the west, Africa on the north, and three great southern peninsulas of Asia on the east as a chain of great islands terminating in Australia. Wherever the Indian Ocean touches land, if it finds dark-skinned people." In a work entitled India, H.G. Rawlinson notes that German anthropologist Baron E. von Exkedet considers the oldest stratum going back to an early post-glacial period in India to have been a dark-skinned group akin to the early Negroid stocks of Africa and Melanesia. These Indo-Negrids once covered the whole peninsula. True Myth, Black Vikings of the Middle Ages by Nasheed Al-Amin, page 5. In the Arabs, Bertram Thomas states, "The original inhabitants of Arabia were not the familiar Arabs of our own time, but a very much darker people, a proto-Negroid belt of mankind stretched across of the ancient world from Africa to Malaya." There's two figures shown here in a picture, and one figure in these pictures would be considered an African man today, and another one of that is a woman looking like an African woman with her breasts out. Figure 1. A Negroid head or mask from ancient Sicily. Curled hair, wide nose, thick lips denote an individual of African phenotype that would be classified as a Mediterranean type of dark white by Eurocentric anthropologists. Figure 1b, the depiction of a Wendell of Venus statuette with kindred hair and large breasts. Statuettes of this type were first unearthed in Austria in the latter part of the 19th century and subsequently unearthed in other areas of Europe and Asia, usually 4 to 5 feet high. The remnants of the black-skinned Australoids who once overspread much of the Earth, whose remaining representatives today are most clearly seen among the people known as the Aborigines in Australia, are believed after a fairly recent find to have occupied the continent of Australia for at least 62,000 years, entering the continent by the now submerged saw whole shelf or else island hopping in rafts and other watercraft among the stretch of Indonesian islands that led to it. New Guinea, Tasmania, New Zealand, and the islands of Melanesia, and other further east into Pacific Ocean was settled by the same race of people, although Eurocentric scholars have developed theories that some of these people belong to different races, even the Caucasian race. There is also evidence of a predominant Australoid presence in Europe, which remained evident. There is also evidence of a which remained evident into modern times. The Racial History of Man. Anthropologist Roland B. Dixon notes that Angles, whom most have classed as Germanic along with Saxons, have an unexpectedly large element of a Proto-Australoid type. Yeah, mega, because the Angles, the Jutes, and all the other tribes that made the Anglo-Saxons were indigenous Asian looking blacks. So of course they would look like an Australian black. Proto-Australoid prominent in Mecklenburg,
Yeah,
northern
we see.
Germany in Neolithic times. So there is a probability that the Australoid or Proto-Australoid human type once overspread most of Asia and Europe. True Myth, Black Vikings of the Middle Ages by Nasheed Al Amin, page 6. The earliest inhabitants of the Philippines were the short, black-skinned Negrito type, who may as well have been of Australoid stock. China and southern Japan also show evidence of a Negrito strain. J. A. Rogers in Sex and Race, Volume 1, quotes French anthropologist H. Imbert, who states, the Negroid races peopled at some time all the south of India, Indochina, and China. Skulls of these Negroes have been found in the island of Formosa, Taiwan. Further, Imbert notes that a classic text, the Tie Li or Chu Li, composed during the Chu dynasty between 1122 to 249 before Common Era, gives a description of the inhabitants with black and oily skin. The reader should note that here we are speaking of a Chinese text that was composed 200 or 300,000 years ago, discussing a China we have been led to believe was always populated by yellow people. Obviously, there were other Chinese people probably who were the remnant of an original black-skinned race. Chinese type of mutated into light skin type, or else intermixed with an albino element in a white forest area. In Central or Northeastern Asia, from which the present Chinese type evolved, although that I need to note that. So you hear that? You hear that? I'm gonna run that back one more time. In Central or Northern Asia, from which the present Chinese type evolved. Central or Northeastern Asia, from which the present
No,
Chinese
no,
type
but it
evolved.
installed Windows 10 Pro, so you have it.
Okay? Central or Northern
All right.
Northeastern Asia. Don't forget that.
I wish I could do.
Although
I wish I could have
very
done.
dark-skinned Chinese was still in evidence in southern areas of China, even at the point of the 20th century. In an article entitled "African Presence in Early China, African Presence in Early Asia," editor Ivan van Sertima, James Brunson notes that
Alright.
numerous Neolithic
Alright,
Negroid
that be safe, brother.
skeletals remains have been unearthed at cities of Yangtze River in the province of Sichuan, Guangxi, Guangdong, Shanxi, Yunnan, and other Bronson and others. Bronson cites Carrington C. Goodrich, A Short History of Chinese People, who notes that Negritos, whom the Chinese call black dwarfs, are reported in the mountain districts of Yangtze, and that they occupy this region as latte the Qin dynasty. Sorry, they occupy this region as late as the Qin dynasty. I don't know why latte was in my brain. We are still we are still some distance away from Europe and Vikings, but it is necessary to travel the prehistoric world so that when we arrive at our intended destination and central subject, it will be easier for us to visualize black-skinned people in Northern Europe. In fact, we will find black dwarves in Scandinavia as well. They are mentioned in the Prose Edda and the Icelandic sagas, often possessing magic and special abilities. And while they are often relegated to mythological beings in Scandinavia, Germany, and the British Isles and other areas of the world, it will become apparent that these black dwarfs existed and still exist in the diminutive peoples, our earliest Homo sapien ancestors who migrated out of Africa in remotest times and spread around the earth, and their presence constituting a true myth or actuality. For the present, the reader should understand that for untold millennia, black-skinned people exclusively predominated in the Proto-Negroid belt of mankind, the wide band of the land sea between 40% N latitude and 40% S latitude around the earth. Eventually, taller physical types of men and women developed in Africa over more millennia with different subdivisions, hair texture, complexional variations, and shapes and bone densities. These two, for whatever reason, would find it necessary to migrate out of Africa over more millennia, populating 6,000 miles wide, a band of land and sea around the earth, encroaching upon the longer settled Negritos or Australoids and to forcing them to more remote regions of the planet. Since these taller types of men out of Africa were essentially black skinned, black or brown or reddish toned, it should not be surprising that black skinned people were the earliest inhabitants of Europe. Cro Magnon man is promoted as the first modern human in Europe, arriving according to most roughly 30 to 35,000 years ago. It is widely proclaimed that the Caucasian or white skinned by a that oh It is widely proclaimed that he was Caucasian or white skinned by a vast body of anthropologists who laud his larger brain, pronounced chin, and straighter forehead hair, and artistic abilities. He is said to have succeeded the Neanderthal man, a pre-human type in Europe and Asia believed to have died out shortly after the true man or Homo sapien spread to those continents. Neanderthal man, more than likely the same pre-human type as Homo erectus, is thought to have migrated into Europe and Asia beginning about 300,000 and 250,000 years ago. If so, he would have arrived around the onset of the warm glaciation, which would have prevented him from occupying the more northerly regions of the continents, although some anthropologists opine that pockets of Neanderthals survived in glaciated areas. True Myths, Black Vikings of the Middle Ages by Rashid Al-Amin, page 7. Netherlands and are believed to have still been occupied most of Europe and Asia. Modern men migrated into these areas, but soon after their populations began to diminish rapidly. More modern man had superior tool and weaponry making abilities and could hunt more efficiently and had better organized tribes and societies. The prevailing theory is that the modern man impinged on the Neanderthal man's food supplies and game hunting, driving them out of areas they had long occupied as moderns poured into their territories. Others believed that there was open warfare and that modern man's superior weapons, spears that could be launched with accuracy, and more advanced hand axes, better communication and fighting tactics, eventually decimated the Neanderthal populations everywhere. Over the last century, the unearthing of both human and pre-human bones has made it abundantly clear that was the cauldron of man's origin and physical maturation. There is no reason to believe that any human type to merge out of Africa was other than black-skinned, including the Neanderthal man.
Damn, damn. Hey, man, release the
Yo,
details. Release the
why do you have to
details.
hit him like that?
Yeah, nah. He hit him with the haymaker. That's the right hook. That's
I
the right
wasn't
hook.
expecting that. Along with Cro-Magnon, along with Cro-Magnon man, is characterized as white by most Western historians. If Neanderthal originated in Africa, they must have been originally black-skinned, although they may have been more hirsute than modern humans. They would have endured nearly the whole of the warm glacial, which would have been long enough to have contributed to the loss of the originally black skin. Although, as I will discuss later, climate might not have been the sole contributor to the loss of pigmentation. A recent article alleges that at least some of the extinct humanoids, i.e., Neanderthals, could have had fair skin and red hair. Primitive makeover. New York Daily News, October 26, 2007. My emphasis. Close bracket. And briefly reports researchers studying the DNA of Neanderthals found a mutation in two individuals that can affect skin and hair pigmentation, reported in yesterday's online issue of the journal Science.
Yeah.
While 20th century researchers, as well as films, documentaries, and commercials discussing Neanderthals, promote the belief that Neanderthals were white skinned.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
This minor article stating that Neanderthals could not have had fair skin and red hair a tac- is a tacit admission that they
Uh-huh.
were not originally so.
Tomorrow, not today. Tomorrow, not today.
Scholars have and anthropologists continue to speculate about the reason for the disappearance of Neanderthals as well as whether modern humans ever mated with them. I will not spend more time here on pre-human hominids, but will return to the question of possible interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals in the next chapter. Another type of modern human is mentioned as being the first Homo sapien to enter Europe, preceding Cro-Magnon. A number of anthropologists assert Grimaldi that Grimaldi man was the first modern human to trod European soil. I think they're talking about Cheddar Man. Like other Legrand Glegg, who asserts
No,
that
but
Grimladis were black people who probably invaded Europe as early as 40,000 BC and thereby became the first human beings to occupy the continent. The first invaders' African presence in early Europe, editor Ivan van Sertima Grimladis entered Europe at the end of the early Paleolithic period, according to sources, as a glacial ice and receded to the southern edge of the North Sea, but still covered most of Britain, the North Sea, and itself, all of Scandinavia, extending eastward into northwest Russia. Two complete Grimladi skeletons as at a Grimladi cave near Menton in the southwest corner of France near the Italian border placed the Negrito Grimladis in Europe at least 40,000 years ago, and pre-human Neanderthals would have been present would be for at least another 5,000 years or so when Cro-Magnon appeared about 35,000 years ago. So it would seem that three types of sapiens were contemporary. For the Eurocentric historian, it is paramount that the presence of a white race be established as early as possible. So Cro-Magnon, whose skeletal remains were unearthed when unearthed in southwest France in 1868, continues to be touted as being Caucasoid white or two complete Grimaldi skeletons unearthed in southeast France in 1901 and immediately classified as Negroid were and continue to be ignored by the Eurocentric scientific community. The Grimaldi relics as of this writing are estimated to be at least 40,000 years old, 5,000 years old, older than Cro-Magnon remains, but it is probable that they were both the same type and that claims of Cro-Magnon man's supposed whiteness is spurious. In Men Out of Asia, Harold S. Goldwyn, speaking of the dispersal of Negroid strains in Asia and the Pacific Islands, quotes Sir Arthur Keefe, new discoveries relating to the antiquity of man as standing. We meet we meet with the same Negroid features amongst members of Cro-Magnon race, the deepest and oldest burials of the Organatians strata of the Grimladi cave, Gladwin 26, revealing that the Cro-Magnon man is not universally accepted as belonging to the Caucasian race by even by some white scholars. And if we know that modern man emerged out of Africa and spread in his blackness around the world, the following commentary of Sheikh Anta Diop, author of Civilizations or Barbarism, is instructive. The Grim Lardy Negroid have left the numerous races all over Europe and Asia, from the Iberian Peninsula to Lake Baikal in Siberia, passing through France, Austria, and the Crimea. And there is none other variety of Homo sapiens that spread the Grimlardi Negroid in Europe or in Asia. Diop asserts that the first white person or Caucasian appeared somewhere around 20,000 years ago in Cro-Magnon, and that Cro-Magnon is possibly that the result of a mutation from the Grimlardi Negroid due to an existence of 20 years in the cold climate of Europe at the end of the last glaciation. My emphasis. There is also possibility that Cro-Magnon man and Grimlardi man are the representatives of only a single type of human, that the classification as separate types is due to scientific misinterpretation. When Cro-Magnon remains were unearthed in 1868, the vast majority of Europeans were white, and European scientists assumed that the bones could be of no other type. When the complete Grimlardi skeletons were unearthed in 1901, the field anthropology was more advanced. The field of anthropology was more advanced, and craniological examinations would have left no doubt that the skulls and perhaps limb and measurements were Negroid. But racist thought in the scientific world was firmly set by them, and the majority of European scientists touted Cro-Magnon man as the first human to enter Europe into the 20th century, a belief which is still prevalent. Other scientists have found too many similarities between the two to consider them to have been separate types, and Diop makes this clear when he states that there were intermediate types between the Negroid Grimlardi and the Europoid Cro-Magnon without any occurrence of interbreeding, and the osteology of the very first Cro-Magnon is Negroid, which seems to have which seems normal. In clearer words, in clearer words, the bone structure and density of even the earliest unearthed Cro-Magnon is Negroid or African, and naturally variations occur in this single type, which have been misidentified as Caucasoid. Therefore, the first modern human to enter Europe and other areas in the world were Grimlardi Negroids at least 40,000 years ago, a date I am certain that will be pushed back considerably sometime in the future. If the reader has not heard of Grimlardi man before, it is only because the vast body of Eurocentric historians has opted to not mention him in the works of prehistoric Europe, preferring instead to uphold Cro-Magnon man and his presumed whiteness, but long before Diop, African American historian J. A. Rogers asserted that Grimlardi Negroid relics may be found from Italy to Russia and as far north as Scandinavia, and long before J. A. Rogers in a work published in the same year, Grimlardi man was unearthed in 1901. Sergei states the types of Cro-Magnon, L'Homme Mort, and French and Belgian localities bear witness to the presence of an African stock in the same region in which we find the Dolomites and other megalithic monuments, the Mediterranean Sea. And it is likely that Grimlardi man had not yet been unearthed when Sergei's The Mediterranean Race was published in 1901, but the above quote indicates that G. Sergei was at least one European scholar who had noted that the Negroid characteristics of Cro-Magnon and connected this African type with the erecting of megalithic huge stone structures besides North Africa. These structures are found throughout most of Western Europe and from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal to Scandinavia, and will be discussed in a later chapter. It was it was the Grimlardis who brought them well-made flint instruments, the bow and arrow, improved spears, and spear points are characterized by wall painting and statues. These appeared in what has been termed the Organician Age, which began 35,000 years ago, according to present assignments of particular ages or periods of man, around the ones of the later prehistoric, of the later Paleolithic period. Among the most notable artifacts were statuettes of Negroid females carved in limestone. The first of these relics were unearthed in present-day southern Austria in 1909 and was designed Venus of Wenderdorf after the town near which it was discovered. The earliest find stood 4.5 inches with a large breast, steatopia, an excessive fat on the buttocks. So they just found a big a black statuette of a black woman with a big ass, nigga. Just say that. What many scholars have called peppercorn hair, scholars at the time likened it to the women of the Hettentot tribe in South Africa. Since the initial discovery of statuettes, these Venuses have been found at Grimlardi's sites over Europe and Asia. Most scholars consider the oldest of these to be the very first human sculptures. Grimlardi cave art during the same period depicts the types of fauna the Grimlardi hunted: reindeer, bear, mammoth, horses, and often engraved on the stones could fit the palm of a hand. Art, implements, hunting weapons, sewing, and jewelry making continued to evolve toward the end of the later Paleolithic period, and by 20,000 BC had expanded throughout the most habitable areas of the earth. Legrand Clegg II says it is possible that Grimlardi artists created virtually every known form of prehistoric art, including decorative costume pieces such as bracelets and necklaces, buttons, rings, and headbands, decorated tools, amulets, ritual objects, and remarks that the revered Venuses are found as far away as the center of southern Siberia. And Diop states unequivocally Negroids survived everywhere in Europe until the Neolithic period, 12,000 years ago. Spain, Portugal, Belgium, the Balkans. If it is believed that by 20,000 before the present era, several races of mankind evolved or were evolving Caucasoids, and the intermediate types between Grimlades and Caucasoids, with Grimladi Negroids or Cro-Magnon Negroids, if you like, still the type in Europe at this time. The warm glacial ice sheet had nearly receded so that Grimladi Negroids could trek into southern Scandinavia and other areas of northern Europe and Asia. The British Isles were detached from continental Europe and the land bridges, and that had for many millennia joined Europe and Africa was submerged. The twin lakes, once separated by the Italian peninsula, became the Mediterranean Sea we know, stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to the Levant. Almost no European historian mentioned the undeniable presence of blacks or Grimladi Negroids who were of the Australoid type in Europe, crediting Grimladi arts, crafts, and societal achievements to the ostensibly white-skinned Cro-Magnon man. We should realize by now that virtually the inhabitants of Europe to the onset of Paleolithic period Paleolithic period were African or Grimladi Negroids, supposedly vanished in Europe by 12,000 before the Common Era. By the by the many by the many had differentiated into other types of races whose complexions and other physical alterations in human occupying these areas and having altered over millennia, interbreeding between physical and altered groups produced still other who multiplied in the area, still other types who multiplied in the areas they found themselves inhabiting. Pygmy-like Grimladis have had altered over many millennia and having spread over most of the earth did not vanish everywhere somewhere. Some anthropologists call them Negritos, among the earliest inhabitants of the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Southern Asia, and islands stretching into the Pacific. Other groups and the Picts, whom we will hear more about later, who are mentioned in the early history of the British Isles, most notably in Scotland. The Australoid type had spread from Eastern Europe into Southern Asia and Australia, looking, we must assume, as black-skinned and woolly-haired, and the so-called Aborigines whom 19th century English and Irishmen found occupying Australia, whether through interbreeding with some unknown type of natural mutation, is fairly certain that the Mongolians developed out of Australoids, as did the Chinese. Diop contends the first Homo sapien in China evolved around 17,000 before present era, that the present Chinese type evolved around 6,000 before present era. The reader has already been presented with evidence that the early Chinese were very dark skinned, if not black, and the reader has already been offered the evidence that some portion of the Chinese had black and oily skin. Just over 2,000 years ago. In volume 1 of An- Anacalypsis, the eminent Godfrey Higgins makes a case for a black nation in Asia, citing Sir William Jones, who claims a great nation of blacks formerly possessed the domain of Asia. Higgins states that the people who were the Cushites described in Genesis, and that the story of this empire has never been told. Higgins then speaks of two Ethiopians in ancient history, one branch in Egypt, present day Ethiopia, and the other branch in Arabia, Felix, or more likely India. He knows that Herodotus and Eusebius place one branch of this ancient nation in India, and that the religion of Buddha is very ancient. Of Buddha, Higgins state in the most ancient temples scattered throughout Asia, where his worship is yet continued. He is found to He's found black as jet and with the flat face, thick lips, and curly hair of the Negro. And he was talking about the Buddha. The Buddha was meant to be through the Bible called Kush. According to Higgins, the religion of Buddha was dominant throughout the ancient and far-reaching territories of Ethiopia, Kemet, which is Egypt, to the Indus, including the areas of present-day Arabia, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and perhaps the western fringe of China. Sidon at the eastern end of the Mediterranean in present-day Lebanon, was the ancient capital of the black nation known as Ethiopia. Higgins informs us that figures of the god Buddha in the caves of India and in the temples of Kemet are absolutely the same. And that is black-skinned, thick-lipped, and flat-faced, and crisp and curly-haired. We have looked at human origins in Africa and traced man's earliest movements out of the continent into Europe and Asia. The writer believes that Grimladi man and Cro-Magnon were the same Negroids, African blacks who entered Europe at least 40,000 years before the present era, but probably much earlier, to become the first human beings or Homo sapiens to inhabit that continent. It is only Eurocentric historians who focus on Cro-Magnon, whom they have long asserted was Caucasoid, that keeps the marrow of Europe's original inhabitants unsettled. But if Cro-Magnon was black-skinned and Negroid like the Grimaldi, whom the Caucasoid or white, the obvious next question to the grapple with is where did the white people come from? Unless Caucasians arrived on Earth from another planet, which a number of occult works actually allege are the descendants of the Neanderthal man, then they must have evolved out of black-skinned Grimaldis and other types of earthy Homo sapiens, if most anthropologists who have grappled with the question allege the earliest human beings were Grimaldis, out of which other types of humans evolved. The Caucasian likely developed through albinism or albinoism, which seems a most logical. In the ISIS papers, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing mentions in an interview in the winter of 1976 issue of Black Books Bulletin, in which Sheikh Anta Diop states there is absolutely no doubt that the white race which appeared during the Upper Paleolithic period was the product of the process of depigmentation. The modern day assessment mirrors that the esteemed 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer stated a century and a half ago, the white color of skin is not natural to man, and thus there is no such thing as a white race, but every white man is a faded and bleached one. Western scholars and scientists never seem to discuss the matter of Caucasian origins content to have us believe whites predominated in Europe. Today, all the inhabitants of Europe have always been Caucasian, Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon, and included Diop contends that the Caucasoid race appeared 33,000 years ago before the present era, referring to its initial branching from Grimaldi man, or when a period of depigmentation took place. There is no actual consensus regarding the Caucasian development. Diop estimates by the 20,000s before present era, Caucasoids developed to the point of producing exclusively Caucasoid or white offspring, absent to the racial characteristics of Grimaldi Negroid ancestors, classifying this new type of human Cro-Magnon or civilization barbarism. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing noted that Genesis opines that opines in the ISIS papers that Grimaldi albinos were cast out of Grimaldi settlements and relegated to the areas separate from black masses, that this alienation was responsible for the destructive and aggressive behavioral patterns by white people towards all non-white people. She explained what she calls in reaction formation as a response towards as a response that converts that at the physical, at the psychological level, something desired and envied by wholly attainable into something discredited and despised, since alienated albinos or whites were unable to attain the skin color that they coveted. They psychologically claimed that the skin color was disgusting to them and began attributing negative qualities to the color, especially to blackness. Attributing negative qualities to color, especially to blackness, when this ethos developed, whether it occurred during the early stages of mass albinism or after several thousands of Grimaldi albinos saw themselves as a distinct group of dominating a large territory cannot be ascertained with accuracy, but what does seem certain is that the early Neolithic age man had differentiated into several racial types, which included Caucasoids, and the great Grimaldi culture was inclined losing cohesion or simply intermingled with newer types of mankind in territories they are long dominated. However, in no way did Grimaldis or Australoids simply vanish. The murkiest period of human development are the millennia between 12,000 before present era and the rise of the rise of and civilizations anterior to our present time, when the earliest agricultural societies arose 6,000 to 4,000 before present era in the Nile Valley in northeast Africa. Mesopotamian agricultural societies have may have been developed at the same time along the Euphrates, Tigris, and Tigris River in ancient Sumer, present-day Iraq, as well as along the Indus, the eastern portion of the great Ethiopian empire that Higgins made the case for a century and three quarters ago. These above time periods are in accordance with dates most often asserted by Eurocentric historians, but it is possible agricultural societies are older than the generally accepted 8,000 years, especially when considers the antiquity of Kemet, which is Egypt, by which I mean the entire northeast quadrant of Africa, or Kemet, Kush or Ethiopia, Punt or Nubia. Higgins asserts that I will henceforth refer to a greater Ethiopia extended from Kemet to India and its inhabitants, Kushite Negroes, sharing a similar culture, religion, and language. Higgins is not precise in regard to the time period Greater Ethiopia flourished, but it surely would have been between 7,000 to 4,000 years ago, a millennium or less before the world's cradle advanced civilizations began to be plagued by racially different invaders and foreign ideas, but Greater Ethiopia endured a layer date. However, we can derive a sense of Higgins' Ethiopian empire. Several more contemporary works in Stolen Legacy, George G.M. James mentioned by the Greek historian Diodorus and Chemetian high priest Manetho relate a tale about two columns at Naisha, Arabia. One was a column commemorating the goddess Isis, and the other commemorating the god Osiris. On Osiris's column, states James, the god that declared that he had led the army into India to the sources of the Danube, to the sources of the Danube, and as far as the ocean, unidentified, but probably referring to the Black Sea. This means the course of the Chemetian Empire at a very early date included not only the islands of the Aegean Sea and Ionia, but also to the extremities of the east. James is not precise in regard to time, but the cult of Osiris is extremely remote in Egyptian antiquity, far older than the first dynasty. What follows is a statement which has not been seriously considered by Eurocentric historians. In Signs and Symbols, primordial man Albert Churchward offers this reverting assertion. The Assyrian religion is at least 20,000 years old and maybe 50,000 for all any Egyptologist knows that to the contrary. This has been proved by the recent discoveries at Abydos, showing that the Assyrian doctrines existed there in all their glory and perfection more than about 15,000 years ago, and before the Egyptian had the doctrine of a tomb. And to give further credence to the god Osiris's column in Naisha, Arabia, commemorating the extent of Osiris's exploits, outlined by George G.M. James, above historians Charles Finch III in The Star of the Deep Beginnings tells us it can be said what is known as the Near East, what is known as the Near East is more probably thought of Africa's northeast extension because geologically and geographically that it is in fact what it is. It was the main corridor of human migration out of Africa into the rest of the world, and beginning over 100,000 years ago, and it makes sense to find that the earliest definable Near Eastern Neolithic populations are indistinguishably Africoid. We are looking at culturally a province of Neolithic Africa. Speaking of the yogic tradition that the world today understands as the light of the East, which Eurocentric scholars have always insisted that the had its origins in India. Arthur Ra-Un Nefer Amen in Metu Neter, Volume 1, informs the reader that yoga and the yogic tradition in reality is the modification of the light taken by the blacks from Nubia into the Tigris and Indus Valley in prehistoric times. Nefer Amen states that yogic principles, as well as Buddhism, have an African origin, and did not originate in India, as well as the black-skinned populaces of Nubia, Kemet, Ethiopia, Arabia, and India were essentially the same type of people, whether one refers to them as Nubians, Cushites, Ethiopians, or Dravidians, the ancient blacks of India. Only 4 or 5 decades ago, it was common practice for European and American historians and anthropologists to state that Egyptians, Ethiopians, Indians, and of India and Australian Aborigines were members of the Caucasian family, despite the black or dark complexions must have most have always been known to possess. The practice continues to this day, and it is patently absurd. I will not waste time mounting a detailed refutation. What the reader has read so far would be refutation enough. However, the reader might want to consider the following. Which of these Caucasian populaces did recognize their kinship and with the above mentioned peoples? In which of these Caucasian populaces white Europeans not indiscriminately kill the inhabitants during the era of colonialism when relatively minor disputes arose, in which those Caucasian populaces did European whites, recognizing their Caucasian kinship with the recognizing their respective countries, or an attempt to subjugate them wholly, in which of these territories occupied Cauca- by Caucasians did white Europeans not attach the meaning names to the populaces brutes, savages, beasts, niggers, apes, beasts, coolies, burheads, and other long forgotten in all their respective countries? For Eurocentric historians, draping a cloak of whiteness over the above peoples, their efforts to inject whiteness into the earliest dynamic of civilizations, their written works have intentionally promoted white superiority and a false notion that Caucasians were involved in the building of ancient archaeological wonders, and that white-skinned people author, authored all works of art found sprinkled in archaic ruin throughout the territories these Caucasian people inhabited. They could claim that the Caucasians were the builders of the Great Pyramid and the other wonders of the world, claim that the Caucasians charted the constellations, built the interactly designed buildings and temples of India, sailed the seas into the Pacific, peopling them and promoting civilization. More importantly, they could enhance their presence on Earth as civilizers, innovators, when in truth European whites attained civilization relatively recently in historical terms, only after contact with the black skin world, more of which will be discussed in later chapters. Page 13. These comments are not meant to demean, insult, vilify, or diminish in any way what people refer to as Caucasians or whites have accomplished since their ascension to the world. The beginnings of the ascension, however, can be narrowed to a general historical time frame which the elements of civilization already present and extent from Iberia to India, the most centers found in Kemet, which is Egypt, Sumer, which is Iraq, and the Indus Valley, or Greater Ethiopia. The ascension of Europe 6 centuries ago would eventually engender a European Eurocentric recounting of world history and a dominion of the participation of black skinned people in it, anciently or otherwise. Their writings, Eurocentric Western historians have disconnected the relationship of the ancient world. For instance, separating Greater Ethiopia into Egyptian, Sumeria, and Indus Valley or Indian civilization, setting them at odds with each other culturally, chronologically, articularly, architecturally, pardon me, racially, religiously, linguistically, so that we cannot fathom the ancient interrelationship. And it was also after invading areas of this more ancient world that Caucasian or white civilization began to develop. In regard to this ancient black skinned world, some scholars even make a case for a single original language spoken by ancient man. If such a universal language existed, it is logical it would have to have been extant in the vast proto-negroid belt of mankind that stretched across the ancient world, or perhaps in Greater Ethiopia, which is India. A number of historians, including Godfrey and Higgins, Sir William Jones, have remarked upon the early universal language of author John Philip Colhane presents a point to a single origin. Colhane that notes that despite corruptions, that the same words may be deciphered in the names of mountains, lakes, volcanoes, towns, rivers, regions, and waterfalls around the earth, showing that sufficient evidence indicate a strong likelihood that in ancient times, before the Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, certain key names and words were taken out in all directions from the Mediterranean, in some instances by water, and these same names and words can still be found. Colhane points that Don is the name indicating water or river in the concise Oxford Dictionary of English place names, which states Don is an old river, British Dana, which is related to the Danube and is naturally a word for water, found in Sanskrit Danu, rain or moisture. Colhane cites the frequency of dawn in rivers in the British Isles, Eastern Europe, Russia, Don, Densa, Dempia, Dan, in India, Dan, Don, Densiri. There are many other examples he presents too numerous to spend more time on, like Jordan or Danius, Greek mythology, who will be mentioned in a later chapter. Cohen also states in the Scandinavian and Teutonic mythologies, Donar was a forerunner name for the great Thor. And you know what else? Dun or dun means black. But let me continue. Hence, our words thunder and Thursday explains how the word Dan is related to Danade legend, how Dan to be the father of the god Odin, and that is still current rendering that's still a current rendering of the country Denmark is Denmark, a point he does not elaborate, but which the reader might keep in mind for later. It is not precisely known how long man traveled by sea, but by land and sea black-skinned men and women journeyed to the British Isles, Belgium, France, Denmark, Russia, India, China, Indonesia, and the rest of the world in remote times, which the reticence of Eurocentric scholars is unable to completely obscure. I have mentioned Kemet or Egypt often in this chapter, and Kemet will be mentioned a number of times more as we proceed because it was figured more prominently in world affairs than Eurocentric scholars have revealed. It was the gateway to the world, sending colonies out everywhere in remote antiquity, long after Grimaldi man had initially populated the earth. Kemetians or Egyptians closer to our own epoch probably overspread Europe. And we will see that the occupation of this continent, the British Isles and Scandinavia, and despite Eurocentric historians' efforts over the centuries to whiten the ancient Kemetians or Egyptians, they were black-skinned people under various names, civilization to Europe. Dominated it for millennia and had continued presence there into our own present historical age. We will we will come to understand that such people, including those who became known as the Northmen and Vikings, come to understand that such people, including those who became the Northmen of the Vikings, were described as black-skinned as late as a millennia ago, a fact that cannot be unknown to European scholars who have read those Norse sagas and other writings concerning those so-called black heathens who dominated Europe for centuries for the complexions of most Europeans had whitened. Asiatic peoples also ventured into Europe, many of them black-skinned Asians mingling their blood with the Africoid men inhabiting the continent. So whether the Norsemen resembled the archetypical Negroids of Africa that were familiar with the straight-haired, small-nostriled, short-haired Indian or Mongoloid, is it or Mongolian, is left to the reader to surmise. However, it is reasonable to presume that a blending of such people is left to the reader. A blending of such people would produce, many men and women of varying physiognomies, heights, hair textures, body types, with predominantly black or dark skin. A degree in DNA science is not necessary to understand this. Evidence that the Vikings were predominantly black-skinned peoples is not abundant. There is evidence that the Vikings is There is evidence that the Vikings were predominantly black-skinned people is not abundant, but there is enough extent to make a case, as well as demonstrate that Eurocentric historians who have spoon-fed us history have deliberately misinterpreted facts and lied outright in historical works, especially Vikings, especially regarding black-skinned people in Europe. My primary motivation beginning on the research on the Vikings 2 decades ago was to fathom why Christopher Columbus is credited with the discovery of of America, pardon me, even though most people know or have heard that the Vikings or Norsemen sailed to areas of North Africa 500 years earlier. When I began this investigation, I had no idea that Vikings or Norsemen had been other than blonde, blue bearded, white history books, films, and had long contended they were. This work, using primarily English language sources, is the fruit of the early research which I trust will provide the reader with enough evidence that the Norse, specifically those of the Viking Age, around the 9th century to the 11th century so the 9th century to the 12th century common era, were black and dark-skinned people, that likely the primary reason they have not been credited with America's discovery. My intent is also to show that a number of dark or black-skinned peoples occupied Europe, and to offer a more realistic picture of Europe than perhaps ever had been presented. But our journey only just began. We still have ways to go before we look at the Vikings. Before arriving in Scandinavia, we look at the ancient European peoples and invaders into Europe that some historians who took the time to discuss race assert black and dark-skinned people. We will revisit ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and Britain, discuss people who occupied Western Europe before, at the time, Rome's rise, like the Etruscans, Venetians. Much of what is said in ensuing chapters may be new to the average reader, even unbelievable if, however, the reader has appreciated the citations of reputable scholars in this first chapter. Understand that further assertions will be equally supported in first chapter. In this first chapter, we have seen the earliest humans who departed from Africa and spread around from the world, including those who entered Europe, especially black-skinned, and remained so for untold millennia. Now I think it is time we consider a subject Eurocentric scholars never get into, around discussing how did white people evolve. Yep. So we're gonna leave it there today, brothers. We were just reading to you True Myth, Black Vikings of the Middle Ages by Nasheed Al-Amin. We hope to get you this episode, or at least a follow-up to this episode soon. And we will also be reading among this piece of Black or so-called Negroid history, amongst other books, So we're looking forward to it. Again, I was one of your readers today, OXY, Oxy 18X, a representative of 18X Records, and the vibe and the brand known as the Real Vibes. With my co-host, KW, K Dollar, the barbaric president. We're looking forward to putting more videos in the future for you. And this will be our very first video. This is our introduction. Anything you got to say, Kay?
Nah, that's it. Salute to y'all, and we'll be back.
We'll be back with y'all. We appreciate you, and we pray that if you have not already, please consider reading a Bible or getting into history somehow, some way. May you have a blessed day, week, month, and year. Peace.
Peace.